This is part three of the talk on opium to opioids that I had done a few years ago for OSHA USF in Tampa, Florida. Okay, in the first part, we talked about the history of opium from Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Ottoman Empire, and then the migration to India, as well as how it played a big role in the early days of British Empire and how it led to a trade item when they were importing tea, and so that did not have to pay hard cash, and eventually led to the Chinese subjugation with the rise of industrial empire of the West, and they took to the First and the Second China War, and the opium trade continued from say mid 1700s to as late as 1900 uh, against the Chinese desire to stop it, and uh, and that led to uh, granting of Hong Kong to the Brits, and we also talked about the two Jewish families which were instrumental in the establishment of Shanghai as a commercial trade for West and East, and they built the Shanghai as a the central focus. So we talked about length about in part two. Okay, the family of Sassoon and Kaduris. And eventually, with the rise of communism, they were chased out and they lost a lot of their fortune, uh, but and reestablished in British colonies of Bahamas. Okay, so that was part. Now we'll talk about the rise of morphine derivatives. I mean opium derivatives. Sorry, my mistake. And to morphine. I started with the introduction as to how morphine came about to be with the rise of chemical industry, primarily in Germany in the late 19th century, and the German chemist did the chemical derivatives of opium and developed a more powerful analgesic, i.e. morphine. And initially that was administered, it became a big plus in the physician's drug bag, and played a huge role in the Civil War, in the French and English wars, and in the European wars. And then obviously the early days of pharmaceutical, the patent medicine people got into the act and started manufacturing it in large scale and became the big go-to drug for side effects which were resulting from infectious diseases such as cholera, and heart failure was rising at that time. Pain from wars was ever so present. So that, and right along the time, the knowledge was relatively limited, and people were not aware of the huge addictive potential. And even in spite of some warning from some knowledgeable physicians, obviously, and that so the first epidemic right occurred around between 1890s to early 20th century in in the Western world, and it was blamed on the Chinese, and obviously the bad elements that were in the heydays of San Francisco, and the attempts were made by the not just by the Chinese, by the California government, and that led to some regulations that were passed with the Pharmaceutical Act that we talked about. Okay, continued with, and with the discovery of needle that followed in 1844, the rice became more easy to administer, and it's then the commercial venture with big pharmaceutical giants called BD came into existence, and then with the syringe that could be locked, it was became very easy to administer drug, and and it was used in wide varieties of conditions at that time. Now remember, this was before penicillin or any of the war on infections or the so. And at the same time, this was one of the earlier incidents of that it was used for murder. So the good and bad went hand in hand as to how what caused the death of this person, whether it was due to his addiction mode or delivery or the chemical itself. So that was a controversy, but obviously multiple factors played a role in early death. Okay. And we already talked about how the naming of Morpheus, the god of dreams, and Hypnos, we talked about briefly. Okay. And the morphine basically is a naturally occurring alkaloid. And why does human body, which is obviously animals and plants, how they're interrelated, that is interesting to see. And that's an interesting story as to how that comes about, as to how nature's evolution has a cross path with what occurs in botanical systems into the human system, as to why we should have this such craving and need for more for opium that became the drug for last 5,000 years almost. And so the varieties earlier, there were powders that were administered, and then later on injection we talked about. And the earliest addiction patients were usually the upper class people who could afford the drug, and even middle class women were not exempt. And the respectable Smithsonian magazine summarized some of these early 19th century opiate addiction very nicely in this link that I have shared on the slide here for those of you who want to read more about it. Okay, now the brain is the big factor. Obviously, morphine, just not only the pain is in the brain and the messages. If you stub your toe or put your hand on the hot stove, the impulses go by first to the spinal cord, and then later on with the relay of receptors. All the nerves are covered with fatty substance called myelin, and they travel almost with electricity, and then the various chemicals are released at the synaptic cleft, and that's how the messages are transmitted from one nerve to the other. And this was the early days of neurology that was proven with cables versus soups. And so this was established that both were correct in their own fashion. And that was the early days of neurosurgery. And ultimately, the messages goes down to the thalamus and the various nuclei, which basically it's a fancy word of saying a cluster of neurons that takes place. And so this is, the nucleic accumbens in mental tegmental area, which we'll talk about in just. So the brain's reward system, that is the pain relief and the release of dopamine, which is the stimulant that is hijacked by the drugs. Okay, and all these reward system is primarily involved in motivation, and also involved with when you're in love or and type. So this is hijacked. And this is released by the VTA. That's a big fancy word for ventral tegmental area. And at the same time, the other part of the brains are involved, which are the so-called inhibitory areas. This is the frontal lobe, that is the brake. So that means that even though you know that this is like the classical thing about the marshmallow test that is detected in children as to who will have delayed gratification. And it's somewhat late to develop as we get older. That's why the teenagers get more into trouble quickly, and they become more susceptible to addiction as well. So that is one of the reasons why you don't want to start smoking at a young age. Okay, it shouldn't start at any age, but that, again, that has a huge potential of getting addicted to the drugs such as smoking, alcohol, and obviously street drugs. Okay, so this is the prefrontal cortex, which controls your impulsivity and behavior. Okay, so the brain is the master organ involved in all this, and this is called, and there are receptors called nociceptors that has to do with pain, and you can see that the brain has definitely tissue changes, so it's not just lack of willpower or something that was initially attributed to that. This is, and now this is called a functional magnetic resonance image, and that is, and the yellow shows there is more activity that is taking place in that region. So the healthy brain is nicely well. On the other hand, the brain which is diseased due to cocaine use, you can see how the frontal part is relatively low density. Okay, so and now, so one can see that is a biological basis for addiction, and there are some people who are genetically more susceptible. And at the same time, the societal situation is to if you're living in a poor area was surrounded by street drugs, and again, the society looks down upon as a lack of willpower and junkie, and that's why the treatment was not offered. You know, people would treat infectious illnesses, but anything that has to do with self-control is looked down upon by society. And again, so this is in factors very easily now, but at the same time, people who are overeating sugar and gaining weight and have diabetes, they're not looked down upon as lack of self-control, but certain things have been always been denigrated by society at large. Okay, and the physical dependency is a real factor. And there are varieties of this does run in the families, hard to believe that that can be, but there is a fourfold increase if there is somebody in the family that is involved. And so there are multiple factors that are involved in addiction behavior. Now this is a nice video from a little known place called Harvard, which you may enjoy. Let it play.
While out for a ride, she falls and breaks her arm. Special cells called neurons send a signal through the spinal cord to the brain, which interprets the signal as pain. Susan understands the pain means she needs to go to the hospital, and her body is equipped for survival, helping her not to panic so she can seek help. Many of her neurons are covered in proteins called opioid receptors. These receptors act like a brake to slow down the neuron's ability to send pain signals. When injured, her body releases natural painkillers called endorphins. Like a key in a lock, endorphins activate opioid receptors, slowing down the pain signal and preventing a panic. Susan gets treated for the broken bone, but 3 months later, her arm still hurts. And now that pain is making her feel depressed and anxious. So her doctor prescribes an opioid painkiller. There are many different opioids, but they all share a chemical similarity to our own endorphins. This allows them to bind to the same opioid receptors and stop pain signals. But that's not all they do. Deep inside Susan's brain is a region called the ventral tegmental area, or VTA for short. The VTA is full of neurons that produce a chemical called dopamine. When something good happens, dopamine is released, giving Susan a feeling of pleasure. This helps teach her brain to keep seeking out good things. To keep dopamine neurons in check, inhibitory neurons keep the brakes on until something good comes along. Just like the pain neuron, these neurons are covered in opioid receptors. When Susan takes the painkiller prescribed by her doctor, the opioid receptors turn off the inhibitory neurons and release the brake on the dopamine neurons. The rush of dopamine temporarily eliminates Susan's depression and anxiety, and she feels relief, calmness, and even euphoria. As Susan continues to take the painkillers, her brain responds by trying to regain its balance. Her inhibitory neurons work extra hard even when the opioid receptors are activated, and it becomes harder and harder for her dopamine neurons to release dopamine. Susan finds that she needs to increase her dose of painkillers in order to feel comfortable. This is called tolerance. Eventually, Susan's pills run out. Inhibitory neurons that had been working overtime are let loose, clamping down on those dopamine neurons and shutting them off almost completely. Now, not only is Susan in pain, but the depression and anxiety come back. On top of that, Susan feels ravaged by an inescapable physical sickness far worse than any flu. Susan's body is going through withdrawal. Most people who take opioids for a long time tend to experience some withdrawal, but they can still stop taking the pills and return to normal. But for people like Susan, it's not so easy. Her genetics and the environment she grew up in put her at a higher risk for addiction. Her withdrawal symptoms aren't just unpleasant, they're unbearable. Susan thinks the only way to feel normal is to find more opioids. And this is how the cycle of opioid addiction emerges, driven by a brain trying to regain its balance. But there is hope for Susan. Though the road to recovery can be challenging and there may be setbacks, treatment can retrain Susan's brain. With the help of medication and therapy, Susan finds pleasure in her life once again.
I hate to sound cynical, but if she can afford it, and if it's available in the area where she lives. So that's the big risk factor. So this again summarizes nicely that this slide already talked about, okay, and the needle takes away the pain. So this is a rock and roll video, but I think due to concerns about copyright, I'm not going to show it. So the factors, and sometimes, it's like the women develop addiction due to their male partners who talk them into or participating. So there are varieties of social factors. And last but not the least, the physician, the big pharma, and a lack of information, and so the death of despair, as it was called, when you lost a job, when you are hurting all over from working in the mines, played a big factor. So the varieties of factors led to addiction, as the crisis that we are seeing now. And so this is again, and at the same time, on the tails of it, the other factors that come into play are the risk of infections, HIV, hepatitis, and even needle abscesses. And most of the drug people who are physically dependent upon it is to, spend as much as 70% of their time looking for drugs, either trying to score a hit or trying to get money in whatever way that's possible. So that leads to a lot of criminal behavior. And the addiction, it's basically the origin of the word is enslaved. It's a Latin origin of the word. So this can occur in a matter of weeks, that was given for a fracture, okay, with good intentions in a larger than what can be now considered safe. So finally, the physician community is learning as to how to regulate it. So and the FDA and the CDC are trying to limit the supply. Okay, now in medicine, when medical students have to remember a lot of facts, so they have a lot of mnemonics, and this is a cute one that is I wasn't taught about that, but this is makes sense. That M is for meiosis, means small pupil. O is orthostatic hypotension, means the blood pressure drops when you get up. Okay, respiratory depression, which is very obvious because sometimes people just stop breathing with overdose. Physical dependency, we already talked about it, Lynn. Histamine release, that's why their mouth drools and their nose drills. So histamine release, like an allergic response, basically, like when you go to poison ivy, increase intracranial pressure, so you really feel miserable. You get sick to your stomach. Initially you get this sense of euphoria, of feeling great, you're on top of the world, and you get sedated, obviously. The drug is slowly absorbed from the gut when, type of thing. And when injected, it's very quick, obviously, and so 15 minutes or so. And the effect lasts for about 4 hours or so. You have to score another hit. Okay, it's gone in 24 hours, so basically totally gone. So because of this abuse and the opioid crisis, the CDC give guidelines that initial dose should be restricted to 80 milligrams in 23 or 24 hours. And the dose is prescribed generally, 10 to 15 milligrams. So you can just see it can be used about every 4 hours. So it just works out. But this does not take into account people who are dependent upon it, or people who are in a lot more pain due to cancer or trauma. Okay, so that the CDC did not take into account. So a lot of physicians wrote clarification that this does not address the chronic pain or intractable pain symptoms. So CDC revised the clarification guidelines because it is otherwise the physician community was running or walking on eggshells. They could be penalized and they could lose their practice license. So there is a clear-cut risk and rapid tapering that the guidelines, well-intentioned they were, did not take into account. And now the mechanism of action we already talked about. They primarily start in the very beginning, the first order neuron in the spinal cord, And then they primarily work in the brain, as the slide in the video illustrated. And they also have a very mood altering effect, make you sleepy. And again, you just said, sort of get no care type of thing. So this is what is called nociceptors, means pain. It starts in the dorsal root ganglion. And we already talked about the soups and cables. The soups are the chemicals that are released primarily called glutamine. And there is a substance P, which is actually a type of protein that is released. And primarily the impulses go into the thalamus area, which is in the soup, your midbrain. And that is the kind of relay center. And then it goes to your limbic system. That's the emotional response. Okay. So and the opioids inhibit your nerve firing. Basically, the work decrease and modulate the signal. And also, then to get more technical, they worked at the synaptic cleft, which is the junction between two neurons, and they decrease the calcium entry and cause the polarization. That is, so there's electricity involved in this also. So both the ideology of chemicals and electricity, they're both varied. And the question arises that there are genuinely opioid receptors. So why did, as we talked about earlier, why did the receptors evolve in the first place? So now, before we get into the science of it, detailed science, and dwell more into it, this is just a summary of the pharmacological actions. We already talked about analgesia, that is pain relief, work on brain, sedation. Antitussive means prevents you from cough. This was important when there was no treatment for TB or whooping cough or type of thing. So it was suppress the cough. You cannot cure the illness, but at least you were able to, physicians were able to treat the symptom, nausea and vomiting, so emesis that is take place. But at the same time, these drugs can cause vomiting by themselves. Pupils get small, we already talked about. It slows down the respiration. It controls your body response to heat, and it again slows down your motility in the stomach. In larger doses, it can affect your heart. It can cause urinary retention, and extreme large doses can cause convulsions. So these are just essential things. And the mechanisms are complex, for the medically inclined people. These are some of the guidelines that I have elicited to, but it gets into a lot more detail than you'd care to know. So varieties of receptors, the so-called opioid receptors, are influenced by morphine-like drugs, and that can cause death, in larger doses. And so it can really, that's one of the reasons why you see a lot of deaths on streets. It can have regulation of the heat signal. Okay. And again, we already talked about this slows down the movement of the gut, and it can cause intestinal spasm. And one of the worst effects of opium is the tremendous, very severe constipation can occur. And it can also has your digestive system can get affected in your biliary tract. Okay. So it causes the constriction, and you need to expand the tubes with atropine, which is, makes the pupils bigger also. Okay. And, can see it can affect, no direct effect at the same time, but in larger doses, it can cause low blood pressure and slow down the heart rate because the blood vessels in the distal area expand. And your varieties of nerves, that is the vagal, the wandering nerve that goes through the body, gets, and causes increased intracranial pressure. One of the mnemonics comes to mind. So this explains in more detail. And the histamine is released, so it can cause bronchial spasm. So it's worse for asthmatic people. And varieties of hormones are affected as well. Your lactation hormone, and causes bladder retention, which we already mentioned earlier. So it has huge wide-reaching effect. And again, so there are some historical data for this. In Freud, who was suffering from lung cancer, and throat cancer rather, persuaded his doctor to help him commit suicide. So, and instead large dose of morphine, so he died. The famous psychoanalyst or psychiatrist, died, again due to severe pain. He just couldn't bear it. Okay. Now, these are these varieties of, this is a more graphic diagram of how the nerve fibers work. Okay, let's see if I can zoom in as to how the peripheral nervous system, pain starts, the temperature sensation from the right side of the body, in first order neuron, it crosses over very quickly, and there are varieties of tracks which travel very quickly. The information is traveled along into the midbrain. Okay, let me escape that and then move over to the other side. And the first order neuron, so then it goes, okay, to the varieties of thalamus that we've talked about. Okay, so finally the impulse heads into the thalamus area. Okay, I'm sorry, I just lost my slide here. Okay, let me make sure I'm sharing the correct slide. Okay, yeah, so we should be back in business. Okay, I think I was trying to get too cute, so I lost my share. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, and there are, it took us a while to figure out as to why this, so there turns out there are natural opioid receptor called enkephaline. This was only in the 70s we came to learn about it. There was people were discovered there are chains in the brains of pigs, and they were called enkephaline, which was, you can understand this is cephalon means head. So these were inside. They have the same qualities of morphine as to C, which helped answer why brain is so sensitive to externally administered morphine. So these people were discovering, working on the pituitary and hormones, had discovered varieties of chemicals, and there were pain-killing properties were discovered. So there are varieties of receptors have been discovered in, okay, as with the advance of chemistry and molecular medicine. Okay, okay, and this is apparent, so when has to do with the so-called, in medicine, people would like to go back to their Greek naming system, so they were called alpha, beta, and gamma receptors. And beta receptors are the so-called high. So that means when you're happy, you just almost emotionally you get, so good that you're tearing up, and they don't cross the. So these are called the happy molecule called anandamide. So anand is the Sanskrit word for happiness. Okay, and there are some cannabinoid receptors as well, so which work on cannabis. So again, you feel kind of happy around all systems. So kumbaya type of effect though. So this allowed that the brain has receptors for painkillers, which the pituitary releases under great stress. So there is like a, and so no wonder the artificially administered morphine plays a big role. So these endogenous receptors called enkephalin and varieties are known as collective name called endogenous morphine. That's why they're called endorphins. Okay, we talked about. Now, basically, they have varieties of amino acid sequence that is, that is the workhorse, because obviously the DNA itself doesn't do much, but the amino acids, which are the workhorse of the chemical messaging system inside your cell and in your heart and brain and all over. So this is the important key. And as a video from Harvard talked about, these are like the work on the ignition key primarily, okay, and the opioid receptor. So that is the big scientific breakdown that came. And this, so this is, let's see if I can zoom in nicely without losing the whole picture, is that the so-called mu receptors, kappa receptors, and delta receptors. So these are the varieties of receptors that affect, again, work on the mood, okay, in the reward system, and it gets into the varieties of details in the big pharmacological effect. So, and the delta receptors can cause respiratory depression, that can lowers your sensitivity to carbon dioxide, okay, and the kappa receptors, they can cause hallucination, anxiety, and restlessness, and obviously that, and we already mentioned constipation. So it can affect it's almost effect. There is no system that is left untouched by the effect of these drugs. So the receptors are widespread in all the other tissues. Okay, and again, so this was, this is another example as to how the morphine, this goes back, historically, this is as early as 1890. Okay, that the injection, can cause harm. So okay, and so the addiction behavior became well known as to how it can cause death. So it worked like a two-edged sword. Okay. And addiction myth, there are varieties of myths that have been perpetuated in the society that this is nothing to do with the vice of the poor, and the immigrants were to be blamed, which again got a good scapegoat, and the opium is worse than alcohol. Okay, and all addicts, it's an urban area population, and withdrawal from opium was relatively straightforward. It's just a matter of willpower. Okay, and then again, so that was those were some of the myths that were widely prevalent. Okay, and then again, nobody was exempt, even from prime minister like Gladstone in Britain and the great Bismarck. They were all had used or abused opium in one way or so, and it affected all classes, and so this was again, and huge amount, almost large population of China was, they did not smoke, but they vaporized it over water type thing. So there was some complex measures were taken to cook opium balls, okay, short and long draw. So they discovered their own all way of, enhancing the effect of the deadly drug. Okay, and the dependence, and so the varieties of word that the video defined as dependence is the tolerance that developed in withdrawal is the one that suffers. So this is, the dependence, and the tolerance develops very quickly, and then finally becomes addiction. So this is the next stage that explains behavioral disorder, referred to desire to a person that feels the effect. So again, they can be, and now obviously the treatment is available, but it's very complicated and expensive, and the society is not willing to splurge for it. Okay, and now at least a reasonable good treatment is synthetic drugs or opioid derivatives is available. Agonist, the first one that needs to be mentioned is called methadone. Okay, but then again, this can be expensive, and a lot of physicians do not want to do any part of it. And sometimes the insurance agencies play hardball with it. They require prioritization. Okay, and the rehab stay can be quite expensive and prolonged. And at the same time, the success rate is not like that of appendix that once it's gone, it's gone. The relapse rate is about 50%. Okay, and then again, the goal is to reduce the dependency and prevent people from dying. Now it definitely works, type, and but at the same time, the stigma that is attached by the society of rehab. Now again, obviously, for a Hollywood actor, it's fashionable to spend a few months in rehab, and one can afford it. But for the ordinary mill worker, that is beyond their reach. Okay, there are varieties of organizations that have risen, called Narcotics Anonymous. Okay, that can provide without the stigma help. And again, there are the varieties of talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy has done their fair share and is effective in reducing the stigma that is associated with abuse and addiction. And now these are just a nice summary of the overdose sign, because this is a very important factor to be remembered. If you don't remember anything from this class, this is a very important point to get across. Okay, so we can just see the face can be pale, people cannot be aroused, the body is totally limp. There can be cyanotic blue due to lack of oxygen. The breathing is slowed down. Heart rate is slow. They're vomiting in their own vomitus. They're drowning, and they cannot talk. Okay, so these are the classic sign of a drug overdose. Okay, it requires very prompt treatment to avoid death. There are varieties of treatment available, called Narcan or naloxone is available. Now, initially, in the early days, was available only with injectable drug, and required some skill to administered and injected, and it wasn't easily available. But the pharmaceutical industry then followed up with the auto injector drug, which gives just a standard idiot-proof dosage. And then more recently, even a nasal spray has been around. So we don't have to look, if you're skittish about injecting somebody, okay, or not comfortable with the technique, then there's a nasal dose can not as effective. And the withdrawal is not pleasant, because when people wake up, they can be a pair to deal with. They can fight with you, and it's not pleasant. And they're miserable, So again, the change in mood, the severe pains, vomiting. Okay, and this was well summarized in a British movie called Trainspotting. That was almost gross to the point. and so this was, but very well dramatized, the withdrawal, that took place. And now, how did the opioid treatment medications work on the brain? So like we already talked about, the receptor is empty, and the methadone, which is the mainstay of drug treatment, is a full agonist, means it blocks the receptors, and it generates the effect. While the other one, buprenorphine, okay, that is a partial agonist, so it generates some limited effect. While the naltrexone is a click antagonist, it's completely blocked. So methadone is similar. So it's kind of a gentle down type of thing. It has a long-lasting effect. It allows for daily dosage. That is a long-acting preparation available, but that still is 3 times a week. So that, again, we are much more likely to miss the dose. And methadone is quite cheap relatively because it's affordable medication. It alleviates the withdrawal symptoms and the craving that patients suffer. And but it blocks this so-called euphoria that took place, okay. So there's, you don't have to be without the drug for a while and to start the treatments. It can be started very quickly as long as people are motivated. And so it's a synthetic drug that attaches to the receptors in the brain. So it's an agonist. So it activates the receptor, On the other hand, Suboxone, okay, or buprenorphine, okay, and that is, again, long-lasting. It controls the craving and the withdrawal symptoms. It attaches to the, it's a partial agonist, so it activates only some of the receptors. There is another third one called naltrexone. It is, again, long-lasting injection administered every 28 days, but it requires withdrawal of all opioid medications. So that can be, a challenge to get over that initial period. So it blocks all the effect of the receptors. So these are varieties of chemicals, are good and bad of both sides. But I would say that the methadone is the mainstay of the treatment and should be offered. And we talked about the triple epidemics. We talked about the morphine, heroin occurred in the 19th to the early 20th century. And then again, the heroin wave became illegal after 1920s and was widely popular in the jazz era. And again, the younger generation rediscovered it with the wars, first the Korean War and then the Vietnam War, because, and then finally the drug merchants from South America, supplied the need that was there already in people who had returned and in the rich countries. So a whole supply chain established, and the varieties of drugs, why people start. That is hard to say, whether it's a company or started by the physician or just a sense of adventure that took place, Okay, and every time, in America, we like to declare wars on illnesses, war on cancer, war on drugs. So this is the fashion type of thing, or war on heart disease, So the varieties of wars have been declared on drugs, but the success has been a marginal at the best, okay. And so this is River Madness. This is one of the earlier pictures. You can see this goes back to the early 20th century. So this was the movies that were made, okay, in the 30s, okay. And again, the war on drugs, it's yeah. But at the same time, they were looked down upon, and the imprisonment and was the mainstay sometimes.
Want to join me here? Won't you be seated, please, ladies and gentlemen? Come on, Dr. Jaffe. Mr. Krogh, Mr. Ehrlichman. Fine. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to summarize for you the meeting that I have just had with the bipartisan leaders, which began at 8 o'clock and was completed 2 hours later. I began the meeting by making this statement, which I think needs to be made to the nation. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive. This will be a worldwide offensive dealing with the problems of sources of supply as well as Americans who may be stationed abroad wherever they are in the world. It will be government-wide, pulling together the 9 different fragmented areas within the government in which this problem is now being handled. and it will be nationwide in terms of a new educational program that we trust will result from the discussions that we have had. With regard to this offensive, it is necessary first to have a new organization. And the new organization will be within the White House. Dr. Jaffe, who will be one of the briefers here today, will be the man directly responsible. He will report directly to me. And he will have the responsibility to take all of the government agencies, 9, that deal with the problems of rehabilitation, in which his primary responsibilities will be research and education, and see that they work not at cross purposes, but work together in dealing with the problem. If we're going to have a successful offensive, we need more money. Consequently, I'm asking the Congress for $155 million in new funds, which will bring the total amount this year in the budget for drug abuse, both in enforcement and treatment, to over $350 million. As far as the new money is concerned, incidentally, I have made it clear to the leaders that if this is not enough, if more can be used, if Dr. Jaffe, after studying this problem, finds that we can use more, more will be provided. In order to defeat this enemy, which is causing such great concern, and correctly so, to so many American families, money will be provided to the extent that it is necessary and to the extent that it will be useful. And finally, in order for this program to be effective, it is necessary that it be conducted on a basis in which the American people all join in it. That's why the meeting was bipartisan. Bipartisan because we needed the support of the Congress, but bipartisan because we needed the leadership of members of the Congress in this field. Fundamentally, it is essential for the American people to be alerted to this danger, to recognize that it is a danger that will not pass with the passing of the war in Vietnam, which has brought to our attention the fact that a number of young Americans have become addicts as they serve abroad, whether in Vietnam or Europe or other places. Because the problem existed before we became involved in Vietnam, it will continue to exist afterwards, and that is why this offensive deals with the problem there in Europe, but will then go on to deal with the problem throughout America. One final word with regard to presidential responsibility in this respect. I very much hesitate always to bring some new responsibility into the White House, because there are so many here, and I believe in delegating those responsibilities to the departments. But I consider this problem so urgent. I also found that it was scattered so much throughout the government, with so much conflict, without coordination, that it had to be brought into the White House, and consequently, I have brought Dr. Jaffe into the White House, directly reporting to me, so that we...
Okay, so, and now, during the Kennedy era, Community Health Initiative and National Institute of Mental Health was established for education, and that the mandatory sentences were removed, and the various schedule of drugs was Schedule 1 to 5, and at the same time, the Drug Enforcement Agency more had focused on the African American community, and during the hippie era, Dr. Timothy Leary popularized the drugs. Drop in and drop out. At the same time, during the Carter administration, they worked with Mexico. Reagan had a little different approach to it, and by this time, more dangerous drugs such as crack cocaine and others were available, so this was weaponized. And by this time, the Asian countries were involved in exporting drug, and Thailand and Cambodia and Laos were the big centers for drug manufacturing. And again, and so depending upon who was in power, the approach of the United States government's changed. Nancy Reagan's policy, that was that just say no to the drug, as if it was that easy. So depending upon, so we've been fighting these wars for last 30 or 40 years, starting from 1900 onwards, and with variable success to show for it. Okay. And this was the example Aria mentioned that earlier, that registration for prescribers and maintenance dose, and the drug jails for 30% of the total. The Bureau of Narcotics was established in 1924, and again, it came from Marseille, which was a big center, which was dramatized in the movies, and even the politician, the great witch hunter, the architect McCarthy was himself a morphine. And there are a lot of time physicians arrested for they were lost their licenses, and again there were some special fines that are installed. Okay, and this again, when the money was involved, the rise of mafia was quite involved in it. And as you remember from the movie Godfather, it was kept in the darkies, so to speak. So, and the mafia had a huge role in importing and distributing drugs. And again, in the 1950s, the racial profiling was in practice. And we already saw the movie you saw the movie titled The River Madness that was released as early as 1936. Okay, and this, and this the war on drugs, type of thing, and so we spend a lot of money with some varieties of but the actual number of deaths did not increase. The United Nations Convention was not prepared for the rise of the synthetic drugs, which was hugely powerful. As recently as 2017, there were huge narcan use, used 9,600 times just in one city alone. And there was a whole drug chain that was established from Mexico to Chicago via Arizona and St. Louis. Okay, and so this was, the heroin use became number one. The opioid was available, traveled all the way to Canada. Okay, and at the same time, the research continued for so-called the panacea, the non-addictive drug, i.e., of derivative. Initially it was thought morphine was thought to be non-addictive. Later on, believe it or not, even heroin was considered non-addictive. Later on, with the modification of the chemical formula, came into oxycodone, and then Demerol, the synthetic, was advised. And when we were in practice, another drug which was marketed called Talwin or pentoxacocaine. Okay, and this was again became fondly found that it was not that effective. We were wrong in assuming that they all had potential. And that's it. This was another one that I wasn't quite aware of it. This was cultivated in the Horn of Africa in the region for thousands of years. It was used as a chewing drug for euphoric effect, and it has synthetic chemicals called cathinones. Okay, and there are synthetic salts that are available called bath salts. They're humanoid stimulants. They're related to them, and they're found in this card. So let's just play this video just for interest of something different. Okay, I apologize. I thought my video would be playing, but somehow there's some glitch with the videos. But it's understand it's called khat, Khat, that is common in Africa. Okay, and that's again an addictive substance. And there are other drugs which have come and gone. MDMA, the ecstasy drug, or the so-called rape and date rape drug. Okay, and this was devised by a well-known chemist, Dr. Alexander Shulgin, who spent almost his life, and varieties of, so they've written, almost massive tomes, okay, on phenylethylamines and tryptamines, okay. And so I've never considered my research to be dangerous and hope that to develop medicine to help people. So this was he worked on it for 40 years, studying drugs that improve the human condition. Okay, and and obviously he was a genuine researcher, and then later on, the LSD was discovered, by various Hoffman discovered accidentally, and so this was, and then again, the main purpose of the treatment is harm reduction, and there are varieties of educational posters, this was, and the so-called rave parties had a big role in contributing to the addiction phenomenon. Okay, and then again, different states have had different approach. Like some of the European countries, i.e., Switzerland, they were letting addicts inject the heroin, and some of the city of Victoria or Vancouver tried this experiment, but again, that has been that did not get as much success. And sometimes the Europeans had some success with that. They had reduced the car thefts and burglaries. Okay, but the West Coast experience has been a bust with this from what I've discovered. Okay, okay. Hopefully this one will be.
Then, yeah, there you go. Yeah, there's like a tiny little bit.
Just a drop or two. It takes a little while. You have to tap it. There you go. Close it and shake it. Yellow.
So what is that?
That's bath salt.
Okay, let's not take bath salts.
Holy we just wasted like $100.
I'm fine with that. I'd rather not take bath salts.
Yeah, that's so
Great, thank you. I feel like this was worth our time.
yeah.
I am Adam Akhter, and I'm the founder of the Bunk Police. I am from Texas. I'm an Eagle Scout, trying to do a good thing for the planet. It's a company that distributes test kits so people can make sure that their drugs are what they intend to take and not something that's going to kill them. They're really easy. You just take a little bit of your substance, put it into a test tube, add a little bit of liquid, it changes colors, and you match it to a chart. That's it. I would say overall, at the majority of US music festivals, we're looking at more than 50% are not pure, and that's a conservative estimate. And by not pure, I mean that they've been cut with something. We have all kinds of different reactions from people purchasing these kits. The vast majority are just surprised when they find out that it's not, that they're angry, confused. I just can't understand how somebody would make that decision knowing that it's not safe and then continuing down that path. We do deal with dealers relatively often as well, and usually they're much more receptive. I've watched a dealer take $10,000 worth of product and just throw it into a porta-john.
Detroit, and some white sass. Some more white sauce. Some more moon rocks. This is a little bit different. It's from Germany. You gotta let me get some of this.
Alright. That is just about as clean a reaction as you can expect from MDMA.
This whole thing didn't really start by accident. I was looking for something along these lines. I wanted to make my mark on the world, and this just dropped into my lap. Just on a whim, I'm looking around the net and I find this forensic supply company, and they sell to the police, and it's actually police only. But I tried to order anyways, and the order went through, and they showed up in my house. So I took these to the next festival that I went to and discovered something very alarming. As it turns out, most of the MDMA, in particular at this event, was synthetic cathinones. Most people know them as bath salts.
Just put one of each, just a little bit.
This is the MDMA I bought off. This guy came around, he told us, he tested it, and yeah, and then this stuff we tested, and we don't have a fucking clue what it is.
MDVP.
MDVP, and that's a big fucking rock.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna toss that back in there.
Okay. I'm gonna test these two, and then I'm gonna put the kit next to it so you can see. Okay, that is bath salts. You can see it's fizzing yellow. If you look at this, all yellow is bath salts. This is clear and is fizzing up, which means it doesn't even register on here. No one even knows what it is. It could be MDVP, it could be a number of things. And these are being sold as MDMA.
Yeah.
Yep.
Beyond noticing the problem, I also noticed that there was a huge demand for them. People were lining up all day into the night trying to get these things, and I only had a certain amount, and I went through them really quickly. So I continued going to music festivals, purchased thousands of additional kits, and did testing for free. People would give me donations, but I was just losing a ton of money every single event. Well, I ran into a chemist, and she is just rock star, works at a huge government lab, and she was like, these things are not that difficult to make. What you should do is you should find all of the patents for the police supply ones. We'll see how to reverse engineer them and tweak them so that we're not violating those products or those patents, and we'll release our own. Oh, it's just been exponential since then. You know, originally I just wanted to have one test kit. We now have 8, you know, plus our thin layer chromatography system for mixed substances. This right here is our...
Okay, so this is a rather long video, so I think, you know, it gets into a lot more detail than one would care for. I didn't realize it was that long, but I think I got a little carried away with that, so I think I'll stop it. But you just get the general idea. There are people who are eating well, and they're treading on the thin ice of the law, and hopefully they'll have some success. And then getting down to the more the vicious drug, which was heroin. You know, the epidemic was well known to most of us who have lived in the West. Okay, Heinrich Dresser is a big German pharmaceutical company that diacetyl morphine capsaicin pain reliever. It called it heroisch, German for strong, and he himself died due to addiction. And again, you know, so this was, and it became the big market of the so-called golden triangle of Southeast Asia. It transfers very rapidly to the brain, converts to morphine, very high levels. And there's another one which is even more potent than that, if one can believe it, called atropine. And it's more potent, is used in veterinary medicine for rhinos and elephants. Okay, and so this was, you know, and after a Second World War, this really took off by, you know, big way by the 1970s from France and other areas, and from Turkey, that big injectable heroin became so this was an alternative, you know, marketed as early as 1894. You know, this is Felix Hoffman, and then later on, you know, you can just say Bayer 23 years later was, you know, okay, so it's a long history, and then people were experimenting with the varieties of acids, you know, and they boiled it with certain chemicals and produced a more potent form, you know, so that was marketed as a non-addictive drug, basically. Okay, and this was, you know, it started with, you know, you can see how it was globalized, the major trafficking routes that took place, growing areas are in green, okay, and then it started migrating from the so-called Golden Triangle and the Golden Crescent, which is the Middle East, and it all, you know, and from Asia, it came to Mexico, synthesized, and again, you know, started from $10 to $30, you know, okay. And the opium is either dried in sun in a sticky paste, you know, it is become, then it's known as Chainaki and used to smoke in opium dens, and then it's mixed with water, lime, and ammonium chloride. So it's a very crude, you know, dirty way of manufacturing it, morphine base, and then again it's created, you know, eventually, but it's in the more marketable product. Okay, and the big smuggling that took place had spent how many million dollars a day for fighting the opium war. Okay, but the war has still continued, and the from, you know, Prime Minister of Britain, you know, there the big, you know, efforts that were made, you know, to travel, you know, okay, and Afghanistan poppy farming has increased, you know, again now, as we talked about in the beginning of this lecture, as to the Afghan government, you know, so they're trying to, the Taliban, they're trying to suppress the sort, you know, but they were one of the largest producers. How successful they are, that remains to be seen, you know, so varieties of initiatives have been given, okay, to substitute the more cash crops such as pomegranates and saffron, okay, whether they'll be successful or not, you know, that remains to be seen. The Taliban has the hard-handed practice, so we wish them success, but that remains to be seen. So I think, you know, we're okay, come to a part where I think I should stop here, and I have about another about 40-50 slides, so I'll do it in the part 4 of this talk. I'm going to stop at this stage, okay, and we'll continue next time. Thank you, folks. Bye-bye.